Imagine a shivering young man huddled beneath a bridge in Vienna. The year is 1909. A biting wind snakes through the arches of the bridge and cuts straight through his thin, worn coat. His boots are scuffed, the soles nearly gone, and his pockets hold nothing but a few copper coins that will barely buy a crust of bread. The night smells of damp stone and smoke from nearby chimneys, yet there's no warmth here, only darkness and the echo of horse-drawn carriages rumbling over the cobblestones above. That man was Adolf Hitler, a name that would one day send chills across the entire world. But in these bleak hours, he was not a dictator, not even a soldier, just a gaunt 19-year-old who had fallen through the cracks of society. To the strangers who passed him on the street, he was another drifter, one of the many who slept in shelters or doorways, invisible against the backdrop of Vienna's grand opera houses and royal palaces. Hitler had come to this glittering city full of hope. He dreamed of becoming a famous painter or architect, someone whose work might hang in galleries or shape skylines. He spent hours sketching the spires of cathedrals and the graceful lines of bridges, carefully shading each stone arch. His satchel was stuffed with drawings, proof, at least in his mind, that talent alone would open doors. But Vienna was not kind to dreamers without credentials. Twice he had applied to the prestigious Academy of Fine Arts, and twice he had failed. The rejection letters were curt, almost cruel, telling him that his drawings lacked life and skill. Each failure wounded his pride, but worse, it left him stranded. Without admission, there was no scholarship, no steady income, no path forward. As the weeks dragged on, Hitler's savings ran out. He rented the cheapest rooms in the city's flophouses, slept on straw mattresses alive with fleas, and queued with the homeless for bowls of thin soup. He tried to sell watercolor postcards to tourists, but buyers were few, and hunger gnawed at him constantly. The Vienna of that era was a city of contrasts. Elegant cafes where writers debated art and politics, and back alleys where the poor scavenged for scraps. The young Hitler wandered between these two worlds, belonging fully to neither. The humiliation of poverty burned in him, and slowly, bitterness took root. He began to resent those who seemed to thrive while he struggled, blaming anyone and anything. Adolf Hitler wasn't born into wealth or power. He came into the world on April 20th, 1889, in Braunau am Inn, a quiet Austrian town near the German border. His father, Alois, was a stern customs officer, a man who valued order and discipline above all else. At home, Alois's word was law. Arguments often ended with a slammed fist on the table or a cutting remark. Bai doted on young Adolf, encouraging the sketches and doodles that filled his school notebooks. Hitler's mother, Clara, was soft-spoken and deeply protective of her children. Those drawings were more than a pastime, they were a refuge. While other boys dreamed of farming or trade, Adolf imagined himself as an artist whose canvases would hang in great halls. Teachers noticed his talent for copying shapes and shading, though they also warned that he lacked patience for strict instruction. Still, in his teenage mind, painting seemed not just an interest but a calling, something grand and inevitable. When Hitler was 16, tragedy struck. His father died suddenly, leaving the household unsettled. 2 years later, his beloved mother passed away from illness. Orphaned and restless, he abandoned his studies and clung even tighter to the idea that art could give his life meaning. By 1907, at just 18, he packed a few belongings, rolled up his sketches, and boarded a train to Vienna, the cultural capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The city dazzled him. Wide boulevards, towering cathedrals, and grand museums stretched as far as the eye could see. He believed he had found the perfect stage for his future success. Confident, he applied to the prestigious Academy of Fine Arts. But reality struck with surprising force. The examiners dismissed most of his portfolio, praising his ability to capture buildings but criticizing his lifeless human figures. He failed the entrance test, not once, but twice. The academy advised him to study architecture, yet without a secondary school diploma, even that door was closed. The rejection wounded him more deeply than he admitted. Instead of finding a new route, Hitler lingered in the city, telling himself he would try again. Money ran thin, and soon he was moving between cheap boarding houses and grim municipal shelters. To survive, he painted small watercolor postcards of Vienna's landmarks, selling them to tourists or through acquaintances. The work kept him alive, but did little for his pride. Vienna at the turn of the century was alive with music, science, and debate, but also with sharp contrasts between wealth and poverty, old traditions and new politics. In coffeehouses and marketplaces, Hitler saw a mix of cultures and ethnicities. Rather than broadening his outlook, the city's diversity fed his growing resentment. He began to search for scapegoats for his disappointments, nursing grievances instead of adapting. Little by little, the enthusiastic boy who once dreamed of adorning gallery walls was disappearing. In his place, a brooding figure was taking shape, a man carrying wounds of rejection, poverty, and anger, drifting ever closer to a darker path. By the summer of 1914, Europe was a powder keg. Political tensions and rival alliances were about to ignite the most devastating conflict the world had ever seen. For Adolf Hitler, who had spent years drifting between cheap hostels in Vienna and Munich, the outbreak of World War I arrived like a lifeline. At last, here was a purpose, a cause that might rescue him from the aimlessness and resentment that had been gnawing at his life. Eager to serve, Hitler volunteered for the German army. He was assigned to the Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment, a unit that would soon find itself in the thick of battle on the Western Front. For the first time in years, he felt that he belonged somewhere, a soldier among millions, united under a single banner. The discipline of army life gave him structure. The camaraderie of the trenches offered the sense of family he had been missing since his parents' deaths. But the reality of war was far from the glory he imagined. In the mud-choked trenches of France and Belgium, soldiers lived among rats, lice, and the constant thunder of artillery. Clouds of poison gas rolled across the battlefield, and machine guns cut down entire lines of men within seconds. Hitler worked as a dispatch runner, carrying messages between command posts under relentless fire. It was dangerous work, yet he performed it with determination, earning 2 medals for bravery, including the Iron Cross, First Class. Even so, the war scarred him. He watched close comrades fall to sniper bullets and mortar blasts. Nights were filled with the groans of the wounded, and the haunting silence of those who wouldn't wake at dawn. The violence, the loss, and the endless waiting forged a hardness in him. As months turned into years, Hitler became convinced that the conflict was a test of strength, not just for soldiers, but for entire nations. When Germany finally surrendered in November 1918, the news hit him like a thunderclap. He was in a military hospital recovering from temporary blindness caused by a gas attack when he heard of the armistice. To Hitler, the defeat felt personal, almost like a betrayal. He could not accept that Germany had been beaten on the battlefield. Instead, he clung to a toxic myth spreading among bitter veterans. The belief that Germany's loss was not due to military failure, but because it had been stabbed in the back by traitors, politicians, and minority groups at home. Adolf Hitler returned from that poisonous idea festered in his mind as he returned to civilian life. The once hopeful artist, now a hardened veteran, found himself adrift again, but with a new, dangerous energy. He sought explanations for his country's humiliation, and extremist groups provided easy answers. They offered someone to blame: minorities, foreigners, democracy itself. Their anger matched his own, and their promises of revenge lit a fire in him. The drifter who had once wandered Vienna with a sketchpad was gone. In his place stood a man ready to channel rage into a destructive mission. When World War I ended, Germany was a wounded nation. The Treaty of Versailles forced it to pay enormous reparations, give up valuable land, and accept blame for the conflict. Inflation spiraled so wildly that a loaf of bread could cost a wheelbarrow full of banknotes. Unemployment soared, and angry crowds filled the streets, demanding someone to rescue them from despair, or to find his homeland humiliated and divided. For a man already carrying bitterness from rejection and hardship, this chaos felt like an opportunity. He attended meetings of small nationalist groups, places where veterans and radicals gathered to vent their frustration. One of these circles, the German Workers' Party, caught his attention. Hitler quickly stood out. His piercing eyes, sharp gestures, and booming voice electrified the room. He could take a jumble of resentments and weave them into a story that made listeners feel powerful again. Before long, Hitler became the group's star speaker. Under his influence, the organization was renamed the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis. He promised a rebirth of German pride, jobs for the unemployed, and vengeance against those he claimed had betrayed the nation. He blamed minority groups, foreign powers, and democratic politicians for Germany's misery. His words gave simple answers to complex problems, and for people living through hunger and hopelessness, they sounded convincing. By the early 1920s, Nazi rallies were drawing thousands. Hitler's speeches were part theater, part threat. He paced the stage, voice rising until crowds roared in agreement. He also organized uniformed followers, the brown-shirted stormtroopers, to intimidate rivals and display strength in the streets. To many, he seemed like the one man bold enough to drag Germany out of the ashes. In 1923, drunk on his own momentum, Hitler tried to grab power outright. With armed supporters, he stormed a beer hall in Munich, declaring a revolution. Yet prison only gave him time to sharpen his ideas. During 9 months behind bars, he dictated Mein Kampf, My Struggle, a book that combined autobiography with a blueprint for domination. It set out a toxic vision, the superiority of a pure German race, hatred for Jews, and dreams of expanding eastward to build a vast empire. Chillingly, it also revealed how he planned to win power legally, then dismantle democracy from within. When Hitler was released, the political winds had shifted. Germany's economy improved briefly, and the Nazis lost support. But then came the Great Depression of 1929, throwing millions out of work. Desperation returned, and Hitler's promises began to sound like salvation again. He toured the country relentlessly, presenting himself as a man of action, a leader who could restore strength and dignity. By 1933, with backroom deals and mass rallies behind him, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. The transformation was complete. The hungry drifter of Vienna had become a ruler obsessed with control and conquest, ready to drag an entire nation down a path of terror. Once Adolf Hitler secured the reins of power in 1933, he moved quickly to crush anything that stood in his way. Newspapers were censored, political opponents were jailed or murdered, and Germany's fragile democracy was dismantled piece by piece. He built a brutal police state where secret informants spied on neighbors, and fear seeped into every conversation. Central to his regime was an ideology rooted in racism and hatred. Hitler portrayed certain groups, especially Jewish people, as enemies of the state, blaming them for Germany's economic troubles and past defeats. Laws stripped Jewish citizens of their rights, forcing them out of jobs and schools, and banning them from public life. Violence escalated, synagogues were burned, businesses destroyed, and families arrested simply for who they were. This campaign of prejudice grew into the Holocaust, one of history's most horrifying crimes. Millions of Jewish men, women, and children, along with Romani people, people with disabilities, political dissidents, and others the Nazis labeled undesirable, were deported to ghettos and concentration camps. In places like Auschwitz and Treblinka, victims faced starvation, forced labor, and systematic extermination. By the war's end, 6 million Jewish people had been murdered, along with millions of others whose only crime was their identity or beliefs. Hitler's ambitions didn't stop at persecution. Convinced Germany needed living space, he launched invasions across Europe. In September 1939, his attack on Poland triggered World War II. The conflict spread like wildfire. France, Britain, the Soviet Union, the United States, and dozens of other nations were drawn in. Entire cities were reduced to rubble. Civilians endured bombings, starvation, and massacres. By 1945, the war had claimed more than 60 million lives, soldiers and civilians alike, leaving behind destruction on a scale the world had never seen. But while Hitler's empire grew, so did his paranoia. He trusted fewer and fewer people, suspecting betrayal even from loyal allies. As Allied armies closed in on Germany from east and west, he retreated into an underground bunker beneath the ruins of Berlin. There, cut off from reality, he issued impossible orders to armies that no longer existed, convinced victory might still be snatched from defeat. By April 1945, the end was inevitable. Soviet troops were only blocks away from his hideout. Faced with the collapse of everything he had built, Hitler chose not to face justice. On April 30th, he took his own life, leaving his followers to scatter or surrender. Above ground, Berlin lay in ashes, and Europe counted the staggering cost of his ambition and hatred. The man who once dreamed of painting peaceful landscapes left behind only ruins, grief, and a warning written in blood, hate, unchecked, can twist a single life and an entire nation into something monstrous. Hitler's journey from a homeless youth to a dictator responsible for mass death reminds us why history matters. Understanding how he rose and what he destroyed is not about glorifying him. It's about learning how prejudice, blind loyalty, and the hunger for power can devastate millions, and why the world must remain vigilant against such darkness.